So I'm happy to welcome you today to the first interview in the series that I'm doing for Psychology Today, and it's with Dr. Janina Fisher. And Janina Fisher has written a number of things. She's a co-author of Sensorimotor Psychotherapy with Pat Ogden, and also a book, Healing the Fragmented Selves of Trauma Survivors, Overcoming Internal Self-Alienation, which we'll be talking about in the interview. So I welcome you to this first interview, and I hope you enjoy it. So, Dr. Fisher, I'm so happy to be able to talk to you today. This is really exciting because this will be the first interview this year for Psychology Today on my column. So, and I know a lot of people are really excited. So, glad to have you.
Wonderful. A pleasure.
Yes. So, I wanted to ask you, I already introduced the book to the readers, the one that's out currently. But, this book is incredible. There's so many things in here that people will enjoy. I can't think of anybody who works with trauma who will not find something in this book, especially the complex cases that so many people see. And very few writers, I think you're one of them, really address those complexities. So I'm just applauding this and hoping people, are aware of it, which I think a lot of people are. But you're really well known for sensorimotor psychotherapy approach. But in this book, actually, you break some new ground about, I think, something that people are not so familiar with. There certainly are people that are familiar with integrating internal family systems into their work. And you brought up some other approaches in your book, too. But can you share some of how you came to do that integration? Because it's very intriguing.
Yeah, well, it goes back to the early 90s because I had been working in the trauma field for 10 years before I met Pat Ogden and I began to train in sensorimotor psychotherapy. So, and from the beginning of this field, in 1990, we were just getting started. We were still convincing people that trauma actually happened and quite commonly. Yeah. And so we integrated whatever worked. We had these very, very traumatized clients for whom straightforward talking therapy did not work and sometimes made them worse. So anything we could find, we integrated. And if it worked, we called it trauma therapy. Because it was the gift of desperation. We became integrators because that was really what the clients needed. And I became interested in splitting and fragmentation and dissociation. Really, even before that, in my pre-doctoral internship, because I loved the complexity. I loved the way in which I was kept on my toes, and always these clients were so complex and always full of surprises. So and they needed more integration than the average client of whatever worked. So it was a big decision to write a book on work that I had developed over, at that point, 20, 30 years.
Yeah, decades. Yeah.
And I was lucky enough to be asked by an editor at Routledge if I would write this book based on a workshop I gave on the same topic at the Psychotherapy Networker.
Yeah.
And so I think this idea that's unfortunately becoming more common now that we have manualized treatments, that there is a treatment, the treatment, and it's the right treatment and everybody should be using it and everybody should be following the manual, is really unfortunate. I mean, I think it's good that we have a vast menu of treatments to draw from, But this idea that there is one right way just doesn't work with trauma. Would you agree? And
Oh,
from your
yes,
experience?
definitely. I think it's really interesting how many programs are sold on the basis of one approach. And of course,
Yeah.
CBT has done really good marketing around this. And I think most of us in the trauma field, I think you might agree, feel that that has never really been workable with the complex trauma in particular.
Absolutely. Because we know, thanks to Bessel van der Kolk's neuroscience research, that when people have a traumatic response, the prefrontal cortex is inhibited.
Mm-hmm.
So, to use a treatment that requires thinking for people who can't think because the thinking part of the
Mm-hmm.
brain is shut down is really, you know, it seems to me it's very simple and straightforward why it's both it doesn't feel empathically attuned to the
Mm-hmm.
clients, which also makes it difficult. But when because they can't think and they can't remember what's a cognitive distortion and they can't remember to practice their
Mm-hmm.
skills.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, what did you like about the integrated family systems? You know, because I really enjoy that approach too. But
Yeah. I mean, what I like about internal family systems is that it's mindfulness based. Any
mm-hmm.
treatment that's mindfulness based is has a leg up on other treatments. And I think although in art therapy you might not um, directly ask the client to be mindful,
Mm-hmm.
the visual arts are all about noticing.
Yeah.
And so it pulls for that mindful, curious, interested consciousness. So I like the fact that it's mindfulness based. I like the fact that it teaches a fluency in in speaking the language of parts. It trains the therapist and then therefore the client to notice all the voices inside.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that really helps people who are overwhelmed by too much internal stimulation,
Mm-hmm.
because if they start to notice the critical thoughts as a critical part, they start to notice their anxiety as an anxious part,
Yeah.
depression as a depressed part. It gives them a different relationship to those feelings and issues.
Mm-hmm. Well, I certainly wish, I have to say, decades ago, I had internal family systems as a model, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, facing
And I
those first few clients that had displayed dissociative, or we called it multiple personality back then, this would have been so helpful, right? And the mindfulness piece as well.
Well, yes, and I found Dick Schwartz's book, The Mosaic Mind,
Mm-hmm.
in 1996 when I was working with some of my first dissociative disorder clients, and it was a godsend
Mm-hmm.
because it helped me to bring sanity to to people whose lives were in chaos, whose minds were in chaos, and whose therapies therefore were in chaos.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I became a believer by actually using it, integrating it into my
Mm-hmm.
practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you just mentioned a moment ago art therapy, and so when I heard you in Scottsdale in January, I was so thrilled to see some drawings come up on the screen, and
Yeah.
it made me really intrigued about how you use drawing with clients. Everybody does it differently, and how you integrate that actually into your practice.
Right. And I have to give some credit to my colleague Deirdre Fay,
Mm.
who first modeled for me how to integrate art therapy into group treatment,
Mm-hmm.
into individual treatment. And so usually, I, most of what I do, I preface with some psychoeducation. But when I ask people to draw, I do it spontaneously because I find if we start doing psychoeducation, they go into their heads.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole point
Yeah.
of drawing is for them to be able to access those, those unconscious and emotional parts of the brain that otherwise don't get access.
Mm-hmm.
So there are two situations in which I particularly like to use drawing. One is when there's so much chaos going on inside that it's very hard for the client to verbalize.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Exactly. You can see written all over the client that there's a lot going on, but they can't really put it into words. And then I hand them a drawing pad and some markers or
mm-hmm.
whatever drawing implement, colored pencils, whatever I have handy. And I say, could you draw a picture of what happens or what is happening inside? And it's always, I mean, it's better than taking a history. It's right. It's better than a lot of the talking interventions that we use to get to know people. And then the other time I love to integrate drawing is when clients are blocked. It's clear we've made some forward motion, and now the client is blocked, stuck, plateaued, and then when I recognize that, I assume that it's a function of parts of the client who are afraid of change, progress, positive emotion, etc. And so the client comes in, and before the client and I can go into whatever our usual dance is, I hand the client the drawing pad and the implements for drawing. And I say, I just have this sense that there's a part or parts that's blocking the work you want to do. Could you draw me a picture of those parts? And it's amazing. I mean, people never say, what do you mean? They never say, I can't. It's very, very interesting. You must see it too. With the paper in front of them and the drawing implements, most people just start drawing.
Yeah. Sometimes they even ask for it. I've had that happen too, thinking like, oh, if I ask, will they comply? Sometimes they just see the thing there and they say, if I make a doodle for you or some stick figures, I don't have the words for this. I may be able to tell you better.
Right. Yeah. And then the other situation, and this I learned from Deirdre Fay, when clients have some part of themselves that they hate, quote unquote, that they reject, disown, don't want any part of, judge in some negative way. Often I'll again hand them the paper and the markers and I'll say, would you draw a picture of that part that intimidates you, that part that you dislike so much, that part that you really want to keep at a distance? And once they've drawn the part, it just changes their whole relationship to it. You see, oh, it's younger. It's so young. It's so intimidating, but actually this is a very young part. So it's fascinating.
Yeah. Well, I think you're saying, too, they get it outside of themselves all of a sudden. It's tangible now. You can see it outside. It's not so much inside. It's inside and outside.
Right.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. It's really amazing.
It is. It really is. Yeah.
No, I think those are really interesting stories. Yeah, that you've just told about that. I love your perspective. It really fits with now reading your book and thinking about how you proceed with psychotherapy. Now the art makes a lot more sense to me too, seeing those drawings. Yeah. So another thing I picked up on in your book, which I've been thinking about for a while since we've worked for decades with trauma, is Judith Herman that you mentioned. And I think you mentioned, and I remember also in a podcast, I think with Guy McPherson, about Judith Herman, who I find to be a very seminal figure in trauma, but I was wondering why you were inspired by her.
Absolutely. And, I think really one of the tragedies is that she developed a number of health problems in 1992, right after her book was published. And then we didn't hear from her for decades because she was battling these health problems. But she was, she and Bessel were the best known pioneer figures in the trauma field.
Yeah, in the 90s, starting in the 90s, yeah.
Right. Yeah. And in 1989, I was a pre-doctoral intern at Cambridge Hospital in Massachusetts, where her clinic is based. And I heard her give a grand rounds, and she said something that changed my whole career path. She said, doesn't it make more sense that people develop symptoms because real things have happened to them, rather than they develop symptoms because of their childhood fantasies? And it just kind of struck me like a ton of bricks. Like, of course, people develop symptoms because real things happen to them. And that really, and it inspired me. I thought, I want to work with people to whom real things have happened. And so it became my professional objective to do a postdoctoral internship in her clinic, which I was able to do. I actually had a year of individual supervision with her in 1992, the same year her book came out.
Well, now I'm jealous.
Yeah, I know. It was really, really wonderful. And I think it's a shame because some of her contributions have sort of gotten integrated into the field as a whole, and we forget that she was the person who brought phase-oriented treatment back into the vocabulary of trauma therapists. And it was really her mission to get therapists to pay attention to the importance of stabilization as a goal in trauma treatment, not just as a warm-up for processing memory.
Yeah, exactly. I still follow her phases. I mean, they're always in the back of my head. I don't know about you, but it's a big foundation for a lot of the work.
Yes, yeah, and there were many things about that she taught me that I still draw on. For example, the other thing that she really was on a mission to bring to the attention of therapists was the importance of psychoeducation. And because, in 1989 and into the mid to late 90s, most therapists thought of psychoeducation as inappropriate because it wasn't therapeutic. We weren't being therapeutic. But Judy Herman said, on the contrary, it's important that the client know everything that we know so that our knowledge about trauma doesn't give us more power in relationship to the client.
The first trauma-informed words were formulated by her, even though we didn't call it trauma-informed. Changed everything.
And re-traumatization was another of her very important concepts. Right? At all costs, we really learned we have to avoid re-traumatizing clients.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, no, I asked you this because I thought you would give a great summary, and I think so many of the younger professionals, as you said, these concepts are out there, but they don't know where they came from.
Right.
And she really is one of the ground zero people for that information. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so
Absolutely.
everybody should read Trauma and Recovery. I'm going
Which
to
is
emphasize
amazing,
that.
Cathy, because trauma and recovery, think 1992,
Hmm.
I can't do the math on
Yeah.
the fly, but that's,
More than
that's
25 years.
more than 25 years ago. Thank you. And it's still, I would say that every word she wrote is still true. We know more now,
Yeah.
but she's such an eloquent writer.
Yeah. Isn't that remarkable, though? I'm glad you said that, too, because I've felt that way. Like, it's 1992 that she wrote these words. However, they still ring true. The language may have changed a little now. We, talk a little bit differently, but the concepts are spot on.
Right.
Yeah. What a visionary. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I still
Absolutely.
am jealous that you got to study with her. But
Yeah.
yeah, that was a fortunate beginning. So,
Yeah.
so here's another one I know that you've interacted with, which is Bessel, van der Kolk. And, I just looked it up before I got on. His book is number 4 on the New York Times bestseller list. And I
Wow.
wanted to ask you, I mean, what do you think about that in terms of where we're at? Where do you think we're at with the body-based approaches now in the professional community? Do you?
We've come such a long, long, long way,
Mhm.
because I can remember when Bessel's 1994 paper entitled "The Body Keeps the Score" was published. People would come up to me and they would say, he's crazy. You don't have anything to do with him. This man thinks that post-traumatic stress is biological. What's he thinking? He's insane. So I feel that the publication of the book, The Body Keeps the Score, and the fact that it's on the New York Times bestseller list is such a remarkable vindication and validation of what many of us have found to be absolutely true, that we can't treat trauma without addressing the body. And it doesn't mean, I think oftentimes people think that when we say addressing the body, they mean that we are going to use touch, or we're going to not, we're not, it's almost as if people have a very black or white view. You either are body focused or you're verbally focused. You're either body focused or you're emotionally focused. But in good body centered psychotherapy, like sensorimotor psychotherapy, the method that I teach, we pay attention to thoughts, to emotion, to visual and auditory information, tactile, kinesthetic. We pay attention to the brain as well as to the gut. And I think there's been a tremendous sea change in terms of interest. But I still feel that the body-based approaches have not yet found their place. Because if we look at the majority of psychotherapists in this country and around the world, and depending on the country, because I travel so much in Europe, I get to talk with therapists from countries where the body is still a bad word. Actually in most of those countries, CBT and psychoanalysis are the two highly accepted forms of treatment.
Yeah.
Everything else is dubious.
Yeah. You're correct. Yes, I my homeland is Italy, and Italy is still very psychoanalytic.
Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Although I'm doing a training now in Italy on the work I write about in my book, and we have a very enthusiastic group of Italian therapists, but all of them are trained in CBT.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. No, it is fascinating to think about where this has come. And as you mentioned, in 1994, I had the same experience of encountering that paper. The Body Keeps the Score. That in moments from now you will read about in Psychotherapy Networker magazine, actually. Yeah, so the next issue is body-based, so we will see how that plays. But for me, and back to, you using the drawing, with your clients, these are very sensory, kinesthetic approaches. So up until then, I didn't feel validated until 1994 rolled around. And this guy, who the heck was this guy saying, this scientist, this one phrase about, visual images and somatosensory experiences being maybe, a little more important than the declarative piece that was missing. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And my other book or publication is a psychoeducational. It's a psychoeducational.
Yeah, let's get to that question. Actually, our last question is the new book that's coming out.
Oh,
I'm just like amazed, like you're just a machine now producing books. So what's the working title? Do you have a working title?
So my working title which is still open to revision, is Working with the Neurobiological Legacy of Trauma. Oh. I somehow feel that's not quite right, so I'm still.
That's why I said working title, because when you finally get it accomplished, you will know the title.
Exactly.
Yeah, the exact one. Yeah.
Right, it's like a baby being born, and then you know the name.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's actually a workbook on trauma treatment, focused on the stabilization of post-traumatic symptoms. And the flip chart on which it's based has been out since 2008, I think. And the reason I thought of you in context of it is that it uses diagrams to explain neuroscience concepts that help people to understand their trauma symptoms and why talking about them isn't the magical cure that many clients hope it will be. And it's very, very interesting. You might have a better idea than I do why it is that these visual diagrams convey so powerfully these, quite complex concepts. But I get emails from trauma survivors all the time saying, "Thank you so much for creating the flip chart."
Yeah.
Because it validates my experience. When I see it in my therapist's office, I feel reassured and comforted. There's something about the diagrams that speaks louder than words. I wonder
if they're validating in some way, because you're right. On social media, a lot of people follow our trauma-informed practice site, and the things that get the most hits are the infographics, is what they call them, that have those kinds of charts on them. And a lot of people who have experienced trauma follow that site. They're not all professionals, and they resonate. So there's something about that visual feedback. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
So this will be a book for, probably for both professionals and people who want to pursue some self-help.
And to me is important. I wrote Healing the Fragmented Self so it could be read by trauma survivors, by therapists, or by both together. Because I do think that many trauma survivors like approaches that are self-healing in nature because they feel more empowered. When they feel that their recovery is dependent on the relationship with the therapist, it loads the relationship with the therapist in ways that can be frightening. What if my therapist dies? What if my therapist gets tired of me? We don't want them to feel that their healing is dependent on anyone else, because we know that it's inherent in them.
Yeah. Well, that's recovery, when they can get rid of us.
Right. Right. Yes. Although, when people finish their work with me, I call it graduation, not termination.
Mm-hmm.
And when it's hard for them to say goodbye, because often we're one of the few healthy relationships they've ever had.
Exactly.
We schedule reunions. I say, you're graduating. But when you graduate from high school, you graduate from college, you go back for reunions.
Mm-hmm.
You see people. So we schedule periodic reunions.
Oh, that's nice. That's a great idea. Yeah.
Yes, so that they can feel I'm not disappearing into a dark hole. They've gone on with their lives. I'm still there, and I still care about how their lives are going.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah. I don't know if it's the same way for you. There's some people I've stayed in touch with for decades, on and off that way.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Often gratifying for the therapist.
Oh, absolutely. It's so nice for the therapist, especially, even when people have had difficult times, you can tell that they're using the resources, they're using the perspective they learned in therapy, and they're not in the same place as when we met them.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So is there anything we missed, or anything you'd like to add, or when is the book, do you kind of project the book will be out? The guesstimate.
The publisher is asking me that.
They're usually the first to ask.
Right. So, and what I've been told is that it takes, I don't know if this is your experience, that it takes roughly 9 months between the submission.
Isn't that an odd number? 9 months.
Isn't that interesting? So, I'm hoping I'll have it done by the end of the summer. That's my. So
2020, we're looking.
We're looking at 2020. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I think a lot of people will be looking forward to that. People really enjoy that workbook format.
Yes. Yeah. And then I really thought that it would be nice to do a workbook to accompany Healing the Fragmented Selves too. That I think it would lend itself to a workbook.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you've got projects lined up.
Yes. Right. Yeah.
So, and anything else? We've covered a lot of the waterfront.
We have covered a lot of the waterfront. I feel very, very excited that the community of art therapists is being introduced to the challenges of working with trauma, because I think it's such a powerful medium for trauma survivors.
Well, this interview will be introduced to the whole expressive arts community. So, because I'm non-denominational, I'm not just art, music, dance, movement, sound, play. I think play is part of the right. I think that's a lot of. I sense that in some of your work too. There's a playfulness that's necessary to engage the person. Absolutely.
There's a quotation from Ron Kurtz that we use in Sensorimotor Psychotherapy that goes, the whole endeavor, meaning the whole endeavor of psychotherapy, is more about fun and play rather than work, motivated by curiosity rather than fear. And I that certainly describes sensorimotor psychotherapy, but I feel those are words to live by. I have to remember that when I sit down with a client, the whole endeavor is about fun and play rather than work, motivated by curiosity rather than fear.
Yeah, that's a powerful statement.
Yeah. And I'm sure you bring that to your work too.
I hope so. I like to play. We'll be playing in Washington, D.C.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Well,
Yeah.
I want to thank you for today. I think this is going to be very interesting to the readers that come to the column. So there'll be some description of your work and post this interview. Yeah, so I think there'll be a lot of excitement about it and your new project too. So you'll have to get that book done very
Okay,
soon.
I
Very
need that
soon.
motivation. Thank you.
Yeah. So.